So this is the third video for the ninth and 10th graders on chapter 23 that deals with the Cold War. And this section here deals with a period that is, well, it talks about a little bit in the 50s and the early 60s where there's a transition in power in the Soviet Union. Stalin died in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev came to power in the Kremlin. And Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, and Nikita Khrushchev they were really regarded as pretty brutal in how they treated Russians and others within the country. And so he dies. In 1957, the Russians, or the Soviets, launch Sputnik, which is their equivalent of our launches into outer space and visit to the moon and all that other stuff that involves space race. And it really put the United States in a spot where we were thrust into saying, well, they think they can do this too, and we needed to be a little bit more on our game in terms of using technology and other things to make that an advantage. So that happens in 57. And then in 1960, there's a unique thing that happens. It's called the U2 incident. I'm going to read a paragraph at the bottom of page 529. While attempting to keep track of Soviet activities, the United States suffered an embarrassing setback in May 1960. 2 weeks before a major summit conference between Western Allies and the Soviet Union, an American U-2 reconnaissance plane piloted by Gary Powers was shot down while flying over Russian territory. Khrushchev used the U-2 incident as an excuse for breaking off talks at the Paris Summit Conference. The Soviet defense minister announced that if further flights over the USSR occurred, the Soviets would fire rockets on the base from which the plane took off. Powers was tried by the Russians and found guilty of espionage and imprisoned. He was released in 1962 in a prisoner exchange. So, in the midst of some of this tension between the U.S. and USSR, this happens. And obviously it was not only an embarrassing situation, but further created some tension between the two countries. Let's shoot ahead to the 1970s. In the 1970s, Richard Nixon is elected president in 68. And in the 70s, he visits mainland China. He was the first U.S. president to do so. And his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, had a policy that was regarded as détente, which means relaxation of tensions. Nixon would later also visited the Soviet Union and signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks Treaty, which is regarded as SALT, with the acronym there, which limited the number of nuclear weapons that each superpower could possess. there was a lot of that going on with just the both sides focused on trying to have some kind of an advantage over the other. As we get into the later 70s with Jimmy Carter as president, there's a strain on the economy here in the United States. We have high interest rates. The economy's in a recession. We ultimately also have the Iran hostage crisis, and America's not feeling good about herself. And this is where I kind of stray from this book. And I'm not a fan of how they don't set this up right. Because this isn't just something, and my students know that I am a fan of Ronald Reagan. I believe he exhibited not only great leadership skills, but also vision for what he wanted for not just the country, but the world. And what I don't like about the Bob Jones book here is how they do not mention other people that played a significant role in joining Reagan. So basically, in a little over 2 years, beginning October 16, 1978, Pope John Paul II is installed as the Pope. That's critical because Pope John Paul was Polish. And that means we now have a Pope from a communist country. And the Soviets didn't like it at all. In fact, my understanding behind closed doors, and this comes from some of the research that has gone on by biographers and others on that era, the Soviets were extremely angry that a Catholic from Poland was installed as the figurehead of the Catholic Church. Meanwhile, while that happened in October 1978, spring the following year, May 1979, Margaret Thatcher, the head of the Conservative Party in England, becomes Prime Minister. And then to kind of bring this trifecta of leadership together, we have the election of Ronald Reagan in the United States in November 1980. So a little over 2 years. And by the time Reagan is inaugurated in January 1981, we have the three key people who have risen to various positions of influence, either heads of state or in the case of the Pope, you have the head of the Catholic Church. And the three of them collectively look at communism square in the eyes, and they tell them it is evil. The Pope ended up doing a series of masses in Poland, just an amazing turnout that further angered the folks in the Kremlin. And Reagan didn't pull any punches with these folks. He consistently called the Soviet Union the evil empire. He did not mince words with them at all. And what we eventually have is we're seeing the seeds of collapse starting to happen in the Soviet Union. This happens with the common people in the country being forced to be in breadlines. Meanwhile, those people, the common people, are beginning to see people in leadership have, they're not in need of anything. So there was this vast disparity that they were seeing, and it was really kind of breeding a lack of trust, a lack of credibility, and average folks in the Soviet Union and other places in the Warsaw Pact were beginning to start asking some really hard questions. And what eventually happens between the leadership saying, don't do as I do as I say, you also have some economic woes that start happening. So all of that contributes to the ascension to the leadership of the USSR by Mikhail Gorbachev in the mid 1980s, and he ushers in these ideas of perestroika and glasnost, and this was a drive to make the Soviet Union more open. Um, it was one of those things where they thought that they were doing things to show the people that they could still maintain power, but make some changes. But ultimately, what ends up happening is it results in their undoing. Because if you are now on page, in Perestroika and Glasnost, starts a narrative on 532 in the book. In 1987, I believe it's 1987, yes, June 1987, Ronald Reagan went to the gates of the Berlin Wall and he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It was regarded as the speech of speeches that Reagan gave that was really kind of his climax point where he said, you know, okay, we've got a lot of negotiations between our countries, we're kind of getting along and all that other stuff, but I'm still calling a spade, and communism is evil. But there's other things that are starting to happen. While the Pope ascends to power over the Catholic Church, you also have unrest that's beginning to happen in Poland. And throughout the 80s, there was this solidarity movement, which was as the 80s drew to a close, the Soviet Empire began unraveling with amazing speed. Gorbachev's internal reforms encouraged new waves of protests against the Soviet Union in Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe. In Poland, resistance to the communist government had been maintained by Solidarity, a powerful labor union. In 1989, Solidarity-led forces secured the election of the first non-communist prime minister in Poland since World War II, and his name was Lech Walesa. And you see his picture there on 533. And from there, you have basically the unraveling of the Soviet bloc. You have Poland go down. You have Hungary. You have Czechoslovakia. You eventually have Yugoslavia, Romania, Bulgaria, others. They're all falling one at a time. East Germany as well. And you have what's leading to not just the tearing down of the Berlin Wall in the late 1980s, but you also have unrest ultimately in the USSR when Boris Yeltsin is now on the scene. I'm just going to read these a couple paragraphs here at the very tail end of this section. In August 1991, the hardline communists made a last stand. Soviet communist leaders detained Gorbachev and announced that he was ill. Furthermore, the Communist Party ordered a 6-month state of emergency. Soviet citizens, led by Yeltsin, resisted, launching a general strike as Yeltsin denounced the action of the hardliners. The army refused to obey orders to fire on the crowds, and the communist coup collapsed. In December 1991, 11 of the Soviet republics declared their independence from the Soviet Union. Following the leadership of Russia, they formed the Commonwealth of Independent States. Gorbachev was a ruler without a country. On December 25th, with little fanfare, he resigned. The Soviet Union dissolved in the independent republics, and with its demise, communism was repudiated. Big turning point. And when this happens, all of those countries that end in stan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, there's a few others, Turkmenistan. There's several there in Central Asia that are former Soviet republics, along with Georgia, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. So that happens, and the Soviet Union is no more. So that is section 3, and we'll upload this video next. Hope everyone is doing well.